The story starts in 2006. A British engineer named Ibn Upton is working at his daily job at Broadcom. His usual job is a corporate engineering job. Nothing exciting is happening. He goes to work, does his job, comes back at his home, and the routine continues forever. But everything is about to change soon. You see, Ibn has been working on something new. He has a brilliant idea. Ever since his childhood, he has been interested in computers and electronics. During his childhood, he was immensely inspired by the computer at his primary school. The computer was the BBC Micro from Akron Computers. During these early days, the computer used to be very expensive. A single computer used to cost £350, so it was quite difficult for schools to buy enough computers for every student. It was then Ibn came with an idea. So, what was this big idea? The idea was to make computers accessible for everyone. Following the Moore's law, computing power has been increasing steadily and the computing costs came down significantly. Most businesses could easily afford a computer by the early 2000s, but there was still a problem for schools and people in very developing countries. Computers were relatively still expensive, which was a very big challenge. While Ibn was creating his own prototypes, he realized that there was a problem within the UK education system. The high computer prices implied that the young students didn't learn computer sciences and thus turned away from the computer professions. And the companies in the UK also lacked computer professionals. Taking inspiration from the BBC's microcomputer, which was a desktop computer, Eben worked on a single board computer for general use during his free time. The idea was to make a computer which is compact, affordable, and can be tinkered with. Eben discussed this idea with the team at the University of Cambridge who had been working on a similar idea of making cost-effective computer for students to learn and play around with. These were the days of widespread adoption of internet. Google was just starting to get widely used. Facebook was becoming popular and Twitter had its first tweet. Thus, a plan came into effect. Eben, along with Rob Williams, Jack Lang, and Alan Mycroft, started working on this new project. The early versions of this computer were still very expensive and used processor available for mobile devices. In 2008, the team started collaboration with Pete Lomas and David Braben and formed the Raspberry Pi Foundation as we know it. On his side, Eben was working on a smaller and cheaper hardware. First, he worked on big boards to make tests and debugging easier, but the end goal was to make a single board computer. Here is the first version of one of his prototypes. As you can probably see, it's quite big and chunky. Now, you might be wondering why it is called Raspberry Pi. You see, many computers from those days used fruit names as their brand name, and Raspberry Pi is not an exception. Before the Raspberry Pi, we had Apple, Acrons, and Apricot computers. So you see where I'm getting with this. Raspberry Pi was just following the trend, but it was also a funny reference to the expression like blowing a raspberry. Now, the second part is a reference to Pi, not the pie that you want to eat, but to Python. In the early days of the Raspberry Pi, it would boot into a Python console where you would enter Python commands and thus the name Pi got on. In 2009, Ibn Upton created the Raspberry Pi Foundation to structure the whole development of this project. Ibn had made up his mind that the goal of the Raspberry Pi Foundation would be to help students learn programming basics at very low cost. After years and years of hard work, the first Raspberry Pi Model B was released in February 2012. It boasted a 256 MB RAM and a Broadcom SoC with the price tag of just $32, which was followed by a simpler and cheaper Model A, which costed about $25. and this is the one which became an instant success. 1 year later, in 2014, Model B Plus was released, which contained several design improvements. It introduced Ethernet capability for the very first time with the 512 megabytes of RAM. Another 1 year later, a new version of the Raspberry Pi was released with the code name Raspberry Pi 2. For some reason, Raspberry Pi uses B for its first release and A for its second release. This new board boasted 1 GB of RAM along with a 40-pin I/O header to play around with the peripherals. These I/O pins allowed the students to use Raspberry Pi to play around with motors and controllers. The very same year, Raspberry Pi Foundation released a new and compact form factor board called Raspberry Pi Zero, which didn't contain Ethernet but for the very first time on the Raspberry Pi boards provided a Wi-Fi capability. Then in 2018, Raspberry Pi 3 was released, which contained both Ethernet and Wi-Fi at the same time. It also contained a much faster Broadcom 2837 processor. The next revision of the Raspberry Pi was released in 2019, which contained much more configuration options. Before the start of COVID, Raspberry Pi boards were relatively affordable with a price range of between $30 to $70. But 2020 saw a dramatic increase in the price of Raspberry Pi boards. This led to an extreme increase in price, with some boards being sold upwards of $200, which goes against the very idea of single board affordable computers. Up till then, Raspberry Pi had been focusing on microprocessor, where the CPUs are able to run a full-fledged operating system. But in 2021, Raspberry Pi dived into the microcontrollers market with the release of Raspberry Pi Pico, its very first microcontroller. Microcontroller runs on a very tiny firmware and are used for very specialized applications. This new version came with an RP2040 microcontroller. Although the supply chain issues and the whole COVID fiasco is behind us, the price has still not come down to pre-COVID levels. Meanwhile, several competitors have arrived in the market to challenge the monopoly of single-board computers. However, the importance of Raspberry Pi cannot be understated. Until April 2023, Raspberry Pi had sold 57 million units, which is a staggering number for such a project. The main goal of Raspberry Pi was to bring back computing for education. Was it a success? Probably. Is it measurable? Not sure. Raspberry Pi has been used everywhere in schools, in industry, and even in International Space Station. And scientists have been using it for various projects. For example, in 2018, the Raspberry Pi Foundation allowed schools to run their code in International Space Station. And that's it. You know everything you need to know about the Raspberry Pi story and its background. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have suggestions about this topic or some anecdotes you want to share about the Raspberry Pi evolution, feel free to leave a comment and see you in the next video.